Many thanks to my supporters on Patreon. If you'd like to join them, check the link in the description. But now, enjoy the video. For many people, ubiquity is synonymous with mediocrity. If you're just doing what everyone else is, then how can you expect to really stand out? The same is true when it comes to cars. Most of the ones you're likely to see on the road today are nothing special. There are millions of others just like them. Car people such as us might even refer to them as NPC vehicles. When trying to define what makes up a typical NPC vehicle, we could of course talk about stuff like generic styling or a lack of driver involvement, the sorts of things that would immediately turn off anyone who has a real automotive passion. But in my opinion, there is no quicker way to consign a car to the dustbin of mediocrity than with these three simple words: front, wheel, drive. Yes, if a car puts power to the ground through only its front wheels, you can almost guarantee that it probably wasn't made for people who actually enjoy driving. The limitations that come with this drivetrain are obvious when compared to rear-wheel drive and even all-wheel drive. But to be honest, you could just boil it down to oversteer cool, understeered not so cool. However, throughout the history of the front-wheel drive car, there have also been many examples of ones that push back against this notion. These are cars that show that front-wheel drive doesn't have to be a byword for practical and boring, whether that be on the road or the racetrack. Today, we're going to delve into the rich but often overlooked world of front-wheel drive performance cars. Front-wheel drive cars can be great, but I think we can all agree that it would really suck if they were the only types of cars out there. In fact, it would be a situation that's not too far off what it's like using the internet without having private internet access. Have you ever found yourself browsing your favorite streaming service only to be disappointed with your limited options? Well, many of them have content that's only available in certain regions. Fortunately, private internet access has servers in over 90 countries, so with just a tap of a button, you can discover pretty much all of it. At the same time, you can feel safe in the knowledge that your personal data is 100% secure, as PIA also encrypts your internet connection. I always make sure to use private internet access whenever I go abroad, as not only can I still watch my favorite shows as if I were at home, I also don't have to worry if I connect to dodgy public Wi-Fi, for example. If any of that sounds good to you, then make sure to use my link, piavpn.com/rofflewaffle, and claim an amazing 83% off and 4 months chucked in as a bonus. And don't worry, there is a 30-day money-back guarantee and 24/7 customer support. Private internet access is one of the world's top-rated VPNs, and with a strict no-logs policy and 30 million satisfied customers, it's easy to see why. Many thanks to private internet access for again supporting the channel. Now, on with the show. So, let's start with a quick history lesson. In the early days of the automobile, rear-engine rear-wheel drive was the preferred drivetrain layout for most car makers. Some did experiment with front-engine front-wheel drive, but it wasn't until the 1930s that it started to become more widespread. The Citroën Traction Avant is widely credited as being the first mass-produced front-wheel drive car. In fact, its name literally means front-wheel drive. In this case, its inline engine was mounted longitudinally, and as it sat behind the front axle, this technically made it front mid-engine. But despite the car's success, the real front-wheel drive revolution was yet to come. In 1959, the British Motor Corporation launched the Mini. Designed by Alekis Agonis, the Mini combined front-wheel drive with a front-mounted transverse engine. This was then complemented by tiny 10-inch wheels which were pushed to the far corners, giving the Mini a truly astounding amount of interior space for its compact size. Although there had already been cars which utilised this transverse front-engine design, the Mini was the first to make full use of its potential. Its immediate popularity not only cemented the car as a pop culture icon, but it also spawned numerous imitators. The concept was so effective that the original Mini continued to be produced with only minor alterations all the way into the year 2000. It even outlasted the car that was designed to replace it, the Austin/Rover Metro. And if we look at current day, the basic formula for a front-wheel drive car is still pretty much the same as what was outlined by the original Mini more than half a century ago. As you can see, the rise of the front-engine front-wheel drive layout was mainly down to the practicality and efficiency it offered. Not only that, but as cars increased in power, it could also be considered a safety feature, as the risk of losing control, especially in adverse conditions, was far lower than with a rear-wheel drive car. Now, this is all well and good for the average consumer, but it doesn't exactly scream performance. Front-wheel drive cars are inherently limited compared to other drivetrain layouts. The obvious point is that the front wheels are tasked with both the steering as well as delivering all of the car's power to the road. This means that when driving fast, you often have to compromise on how much throttle you can use for risk of the car not turning at all, thus reducing cornering speeds. The second drawback is down to weight transfer. As you accelerate, inertia naturally takes weight off the front wheels, meaning reduced traction in front-wheel drive cars. Transverse front-wheel drives do at least have the benefit of the weight of the engine being over the front axle, helping to counteract this somewhat. But it's this combination of factors that results in front-wheel drive cars having inherently worse handling than the equivalent rear-wheel drive car. However, these limitations haven't stopped people from trying to make front-wheel drive cars fast or fun to drive. Really, it's all a matter of perspective. Sure, front-wheel drive cars have plenty of drawbacks, but how can you use their positives to create a better driving experience? This is something that the original Mini was also able to showcase. Ever wondered where the cliche of cars being described as handling like go-karts came from? Well, from most accounts, the Mini actually did. A result of the wheels being positioned on each corner, and also a novel suspension system that used rubber cones instead of springs, giving the car quite a rigid ride. Its extremely low weight of around 600 kilograms meant that its relatively underpowered engine was more than enough to get it up to speed, and on a winding road, it could keep up with pretty much anything. BMC soon capitalized on this by entering it into various racing events in its top-spec Cooper form, from saloon car racing to endurance and rally. Over the next couple of decades, the Mini found success pretty much everywhere, often managing to beat far more powerful rear-wheel drive opponents. It was a real David versus Goliath situation, sometimes to a comical degree. As time went on and front-wheel drive became even more popular, car makers started to realize that there was a market for juiced-up versions of their standard commuter models. The Volkswagen Golf GTI is commonly credited as the car to really popularize this idea, and spawn what we now refer to as the hot hatch. Of course, not all hot hatches were front-wheel drive, but the vast majority were. So, where the Mini used to be an outlier, by the 1980s, high-performance compact front-wheel drives were in vogue. And soon, it wasn't just compacts. As more mid-size and larger cars started to send power to the front wheels for the same practical reasons, sportier versions of these cars started cropping up as well. This leads us to the 1990s, what I consider to be the golden age of front-wheel drive performance cars. Since the Mini burst onto the scene, front-wheel drive cars had maintained a presence within motorsports, but usually in lower divisions as something of a sideshow to more powerful rear-wheel drive and all-wheel drive cars. But as a result of Group A regulations gradually losing popularity in touring car racing, a new rule set was drawn up. Based on the 2-litre formula first seen in the British Touring Car Championship, the Class 2 category, better known as Super Touring, was established. Although it allowed rear-wheel drive and all-wheel drive cars to enter, front-wheel drive was by far the most popular format. As the engine regulations meant that cars struggled to exceed 300 horsepower, front-wheel drives could still be competitive. At the same time, most major manufacturers had at least one front-wheel drive saloon or hatchback which they could use as a basis, thus leading most of them down this route. At its height, the BTCC had more full-on manufacturer-supported works teams competing than pretty much any other racing series on the planet. Super Touring created some truly awesome front-wheel drive race cars, like the Renault Laguna V6, Nissan Primera GT, and memorable Volvo 850 Estate, among many others. But the best part was that most of the manufacturers then created high-spec road versions of these cars to tie in with their touring car exploits. Through this, we got some all-time classics which are only becoming more desirable as time goes on. Sadly, all good things must come to an end, and by the turn of the millennium, Super Touring was on its last legs. The relatively liberal aerodynamic regs resulted in teams spending more on development as time went on, until it became simply unsustainable for most manufacturers. However, the influence that Super Touring had can't be underestimated. Almost as a direct result, front-wheel drive has become the staple for touring car racing, something which is still true even today. So, the lightweight, high-revving super tourers of the 90s were able to capture people's imaginations in a way that other front-wheel drives simply haven't. But what if I were to tell you that there were cars that were like super tourers, but turned up to 11? Following on from the Mini's success in rallying, front-wheel drive cars continue to be campaigned. Lancia achieved great success in international events with their V4 Fulvia, and Saab was able to claim some victories throughout the 60s and 70s with their longitudinal front-engine cars. But as time went on, it became clear that rear-wheel drive was superior, and following the emergence of the Audi Quattro, which powered all 4 of its wheels, front-wheel drive was all but obsolete. The subsequent banning of Group B and replacement with production-based Group A led to a minor resurgence, with front-wheel drive cars able to take a handful of overall WRC podiums and even victories. Of course, as the four-wheel drive cars became more sophisticated, this didn't last for long. However, many manufacturers wanted to keep competing in rallying but didn't have a suitable four-wheel drive machine. So, for 1993, the FIA debuted the 2-litre World Rally Cup, intended specifically for front-wheel drive cars. As the name implies, these were naturally aspirated cars with up to 2-litre engines that competed on World Championship events but under their own class, effectively serving as a feeder series. Although the shortening of the name FIA 2-litre to simply F2 was somewhat coincidental. For the first few years, the cars which competed in this class were fairly basic compacts. But in 1995, the FIA introduced kit cars to F2, which are essentially versions that allowed more significant modifications over the base model than what was previously possible under the Group A regs. Because of this, F2 cars became noticeably faster in 1995. But although it wasn't immediately apparent, by doing this, the FIA had inadvertently created a loophole. At this time, the French National Championship was run almost entirely on tarmac. As such, the French manufacturers, Renault, Citroën and Peugeot, all built F2 cars that were stronger on sealed surfaces so that they could gun for domestic supremacy. But whereas Renault and most other F2 makes also competed in the F2 Cup, which included rounds on gravel, Peugeot and Citroën decided not to. This meant that they could design their cars to be 100% specialized for tarmac with zero compromises. Peugeot brought out their 306 Maxi kit car in 1996, and proceeded to dominate the French championship with Gilles Panizzi at the wheel. They then did the same the following year, but they also decided to enter the 306 into a few tarmac rounds of the World Championship. The impact of the car was immediate, leading with a commanding 1-2 in their first outing at Rally Catalunya. The likes of Subaru and Mitsubishi were completely blown away. But this dominance wouldn't last as Francois Delacour retired and Panizzi suffered a puncture, but still recovered to an impressive third. However, the point had been proven. On dry tarmac, an F2 car could be just as fast, if not faster, than a full-blown WRC machine. And when the Peugeots were again mighty next time out in Corsica, the frustration of the WRC regulars started to show.
It's the same problem as we had in Catalunya, the F2 cars are far quicker.
Well done for Peugeot, and I think somebody has to rethink in the regulations, in my opinion.
But once again, the 306's dominance wouldn't last, as both cars lost time in wet conditions, eventually finishing 3rd and 4th. A Renault Megane Maxi F2 would also finish in 6th overall, courtesy of Philippe Bugalski. In 1998, Peugeot would return, once again causing major headaches. However, even though they looked like they could win outright, they were never quite able to. Delacour's second in Corsica was the car's best result, only being denied a possible victory by heavy rain on day one. Citroën, meanwhile, had brought out their own F2 tarmac monster. They had previously competed using their ZX but with little success, so for 1998, they debuted the Zara F2. The car seemed to have even greater potential than the 306, taking the French championship away from their PSA group rivals. On their WRC debut in Catalunya, they were immediately on the pace, with Jesus Puras leading his home rally. Sadly, he would retire from the lead on day 2, with teammate Bugalski's 5th being the car's highest finish from the 3 rounds they entered, but that wasn't a fair reflection of its true pace. In 1999, Peugeot didn't compete in F2 as they were busy developing and testing their 206 World Rally car, so it was left to Citroën to take up the mantle. And with a whole year of competition under their belts, they were able to use the car's raw speed to full effect. In round 5 at Catalunya, Bugalski achieved a historic feat, the first overall WRC victory for an F2 car. It was also Citroën's first ever victory as well. If this weren't enough, he then repeated the feat just a few weeks later in Corsica, with Puras backing him up for a Citroën 1-2. And when it came to F2 cars mixing it with the big boys, this was the final straw. For 2000, the FIA finally made changes to peg the F2 cars back, mainly through increasing their minimum weights. For 2001, they were then replaced entirely by the much slower Super 1600s. So, that was the story of how a feeder category ended up surpassing the main game, admittedly in very specific conditions. Still, it's a fascinating story that's since gone down in motorsport folklore. But of course, it wasn't just about the giant killing performances as much as the F2 cars themselves. The kit cars in particular were absolutely mental. Although it's the French cars that tend to be the best remembered thanks to their WRC exploits, we can't forget about the other more versatile machines, like the Escort Maxi, Opel/Vauxhall Astra, and Seat Ibiza. The latter was actually the most successful F2 car, winning the championship 3 years on the bounce. All of these cars were characterized by a few things: low curb weight, extremely high revving engines, and super direct handling courtesy of front-wheel drive. By the 90s, differential technology had progressed to the point where 300 horsepower going through the front wheels was very doable, something that seemed inconceivable just a decade earlier. This is one of the most overlooked factors in how the F2 kit cars became such potent forces on tarmac, as they could have almost as much power as the WRC machines, but with just a fraction of the weight. When you watch onboard footage, you can really appreciate just how finely balanced they were. There's not even a hint of understeer. The driver just points it in the right direction, puts their foot down, and the car just goes there. Hopefully you can now understand why the F2 kit cars have such a cult following, and were often said to be the most spectacular rally cars since the Group B days. Not bad for some front-wheel drive hatchbacks. When you really boil it down, the low-weight, high-revs combo is in some ways the perfect recipe for a front-wheel drive car. Cars like these are able to use front-wheel drive to their benefit, rather than it simply being an inherent disadvantage. As such, they just have this overarching appeal that draws people to them, because you just can't get this exact driving experience with any other type of car. And not only is this evident with touring cars and rally cars, but also road cars. If I were to ask you what is the all-time greatest front-wheel drive road car, I think there would be one brand who'd come up more than any other. Honda has become almost synonymous with lightweight front-wheel drive cars that have a strong high-revving engine mated to a finely tuned chassis. For example, a car that many people consider to be some of their finest work is the DC2 Integra, which embodies all of the traits we've discussed. In fact, it was considered one of the finest sports cars of its day, regardless of drivetrain. But when you think about it, cars like the Integra are essentially the closest you can get to having a Super Tourer or F2 kit car on the road, and I think that explains a lot. However, whilst 200 to 300 horsepower is plenty for cars like these to be fun on the road and even the racetrack, some take things a bit further. As you might expect, front-wheel drive drag cars are capable of considerably more. 1900 horsepower was the most that I could find after some quick research. Whilst making this power at all is still extremely impressive, the fact that these cars don't have to go around corners makes life considerably easier. So let's talk about time attack cars. In case you don't know, time attack is a form of motorsport where the goal is to set the fastest lap time you can, kind of like if the qualifying session in most other forms of circuit racing were the main events. Time attack is pretty well known for having quite relaxed regulations, meaning that the cars can get pretty ridiculous. Many time attack championships also have a dedicated front-wheel drive class, so when you put all of this together, the results are almost inevitable. Insane 1000 plus horsepower monsters with monumental wings towering over what started out as just an ordinary compact car. The Honda Civic in various generations is easily the most common choice of time attack weapon, but there was another front-wheel drive car that became quite well known. In 2007, professional drag racer Chris Rado started competing in time attack with a highly modified Scion TC, managing to set some front-wheel drive lap records at circuits across the US. The car originally started out with 300 horsepower, but as time went on, Rado and his world racing team continually worked on increasing this. By the end of 2008, it was making in the region of 700 horsepower, but being front-wheel drive, it wasn't always able to put this power to the ground. So the following year, the car gained an extremely novel front-mounted spoiler to help push the front wheels down and increase traction. It actually looked quite reminiscent of the wings that Formula 1 teams experimented with in the early days of aerodynamics. But no matter how crude it looked, the results spoke for themselves. The TC continued to dominate the front-wheel drive time attack scene, and on occasion it even competed with and beat the rear-wheel drive and all-wheel drive cars. By 2011, the car had evolved into its most recognizable form as it was made to resemble the second generation TC. It also now made 1200 horsepower, allowing Rado to continue his time attack domination. You'll notice that Need for Speed was one of the team's backers, and this connection resulted in the car appearing in the game Need for Speed Shift 2 in 2011, further boosting its status. Albeit in the game, they featured an all-wheel drive version, which I can't seem to find much real-life information about. I'm not 100% sure whether the car actually competed as all-wheel drive, or if it was converted back to front-wheel drive, because Rado continued to set front-wheel drive lap records with it in 2011 and 2012. Maybe someone can let me know in the comments. Many of the Scion's lap records have since been beaten, but for front-wheel drive fanatics in the early 2010s, this was the car. It showcased just what the drivetrain was capable of when there were no limits to hold it back. Today it's still well remembered for being the first of its kind. A truly mad idea that somehow managed to work. However, that can't be said for every radical front-wheel drive race car. Cue the Nissan GT-R LM Nismo. Okay, so this one is kind of a technicality as the car was never intended to be purely front-wheel drive, but it's an interesting story that I still think is worth covering. In 2014, Nissan announced their entrance into the top LMP1 class of the World Endurance Championship, but they wanted to do things a bit differently from their rivals. Firstly, their car would be front-engined, harking back to the Pano's LMP of the early 2000s. But that was just the beginning. Unlike the Panos, their twin-turbo V6 would instead send 500 horsepower to the front wheels. This would then be mated with a kinetic energy recovery system through a flywheel, with the 700 horsepower this generated being sent to the rears through a drive shaft, thus allowing the car to be all-wheel drive. This unique idea was the brainchild of chief engineer Ben Bowlby, who previously designed the Delta Wing and Nissan Z-Od RC. His theory was that by having a larger frontal section, they could generate most of the car's downforce at the front, which is more efficient when compared with most other LMP1 cars that were limited in size at the rear. But whilst it was a neat idea in principle, it was nowhere near as simple in practice. Nissan encountered numerous issues when testing the car, including 2 failed crash tests, and when coupled with a very short development window before its debut in 2015, meant that compromises had to be made. Although they had planned to enter the car in the full championship, they would end up debuting the GT-R LM Nismo at the biggest race of them all, the 24 Hours of Le Mans, and they would be doing it with one arm tied behind their back. Another compromise was that its much-touted hybrid system would not be used, as it was deemed to be too heavy, too complex, and unreliable. This left the car with just the 500 horsepower from the combustion engine being sent to the front wheels. Needless to say, the car did not perform as hoped. In qualifying, the best of the 3 Nissans was some 20 seconds behind the pole-sitting Porsche, and in the race they all encountered major issues. Only one of the cars took the checkered flag, but didn't complete enough laps to even be classified. Following this, Nissan was still committed to competing in the championship, but ended up missing the rest of the races that year to focus on testing instead. But the car would never get the chance to compete in anger again, as Nissan's LMP1 program was axed just a few days before Christmas 2015, with all of the staff being let go in rather controversial circumstances. So, for all of Nissan's bravado, their LMP1 program was a total failure. However, I still think the concept of the car was very fascinating. Regardless of how much time or effort was poured into it, I don't think it was ever going to be a world beater, but it's still interesting to ponder what it could have ended up like. Honestly, I think Nissan's biggest error was in just how high they set their expectations. Because when you think about what the GT-R LM Nismo actually achieved in its sole appearance, it is kind of impressive. Sure, it was miles behind the other LMP1 cars, but on average it was slightly faster than the LMP2 machines, which weren't exactly slow. And they achieved this with all of the power going through the front wheels, something that was totally unheard of in sports car racing. With just a slight shift in perspective, this is actually a pretty inspiring tale. So, even though it never meant to be, the GT-R LM Nismo was yet another fascinating chapter in the front-wheel drive story. So those are the stories from the past, but what about the future of front-wheel drive performance cars? Sadly, things don't look so good. Just last month, we received the sad news that the Honda Civic Type R is being pulled from Europe in 2026. This follows similar recent headlines for the Ford Focus ST and Hyundai i30N. The current Civic Type R is widely considered to be one of the best driver's cars out there, commonly being referred to as the 911 GT3 of front-wheel drive. But it seems that this current FL5 generation will be the last. Those of you who follow the channel might already know that I adore this car and have long wanted to own one myself. And you know what? Now I finally do. This is my Honda Civic Type R. Yes, it is the previous generation FK8 and not the FL5, because unfortunately YouTube doesn't pay that well, but my controversial opinion is that I think it actually looks better. It's a lot more aggressive and in your face, exactly what a Type R should be, even if it rubs some people the wrong way. When talking about front-wheel drive performance cars, I can't pretend like I don't have skin in the game, but to be honest, everything I've said in this video I've believed for a long time. Front-wheel drive cars don't get the respect they deserve. And by owning and driving one of the best ever, I only feel more validated in my point of view. I think in recent years, people have started to realize just how special cars like these are. I mean, there is nothing else on the market that comes close to the Civic Type R. From one perspective, it's a practical Japanese hatchback with plenty of cargo space and a reliable engine. But on the other, it's a 170-mile-an-hour sports car with unmatched driving feel that can keep up with almost anything on a winding road. No other car can do what it does, and that makes its impending demise all the more poignant. Even though there are still a couple left, the reality is that we're looking at a future with no enthusiast front-wheel drive cars, despite the fact that, as the Civic shows, they've never been better. When talking to some people, I get the feeling that they think cars like these are cool, but they would be better if they were, say, rear-wheel drive. Now, that may be true in an objective sense when it comes to raw speed, but I wouldn't want to live in a world where every performance car is rear-wheel drive, or more likely all-wheel drive. If a car like the Civic Type R were rear-wheel drive, it would still be a pretty good rear-wheel drive sports car, but it wouldn't fill that same niche. Being front-wheel drive is what makes it truly unique. If it weren't, I don't think people would care about it anywhere near as much. I hope that with this video, I've been able to not only highlight some incredible front-wheel drive cars, but also the potential of a format that so many people are quick to dismiss. Because if there's anything that you take away from this video, I hope it's the belief that we should be celebrating these differences, not scrubbing them away. As I've shown, front-wheel drive cars can be capable of so much more than you might expect, and at their very best, can even provide driving experiences that just can't be found anywhere else. Sure, most of them might be NPC vehicles, but the ones that aren't show that as long as you keep an open mind, driving nirvana can be found in some truly unexpected places.
Derecha 10 y más, queda 1, derecha situar,